There's a chapter in the Old Testament that does something most people don't realize the Bible ever does. It names a specific empire. It describes how that empire would expand. It describes how it would fall. And then history unfolds almost exactly the way the text said it would. The empire is Persia. What we call modern-day Iran sits on the same land that was once the heart of the Persian Empire. And in Daniel chapter 8, that empire is not hinted at, is not vaguely symbolized and left open to interpretation. It's identified directly. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear about what this video is and what it isn't. This is not one of those prophecy videos where we take today's headlines and force them back into ancient verses. I'm not going to tell you every news story out of Tehran is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. What I am going to do is something much simpler and honestly, much more interesting. We're going to read Daniel chapter 8 carefully, line by line. We're going to look at what the text actually says, and then we're going to compare it to the historical record. Because once you see what Daniel describes and how closely it matches what happened to Persia and then Greece, you may never think about the book of Daniel the same way again. That's what this video is about. Stay with me for 30 minutes. Let me set some expectations up front, because I think it's important to be honest about what kind of video this is. There are two ways to do a video on Bible prophecy. The first way is to start with today's news and work backwards into the Bible to find verses that seem to match. That approach is popular, it gets clicks, but it's also how you end up with a lot of claims that don't hold up under scrutiny, because if you're creative enough, you can make almost any ancient text seem to predict almost anything. I'm not doing that. The second way is to start with the text, read exactly what it says, look at what it predicted specifically, and then check the historical record to see what actually happened. That's what we're doing today. And the reason I'm starting with that disclaimer is because what's in Daniel chapter 8 is genuinely interesting on its own terms, without needing to stretch anything, without needing to force a connection to today's news. Even historians who don't read Daniel as supernatural prophecy often acknowledge that Daniel 8 matches the later Persian and Greek historical sequence with striking detail. That's worth looking at carefully. Let's start with where Daniel fits in the Bible and why this particular chapter matters. We've already done a full video on Daniel on this channel, specifically the lion's den story from Daniel chapter 6. If you haven't seen that one, I'll link it at the end of this video. But here's a quick recap of who Daniel was and why his book matters for what we're looking at today. Daniel was a Jewish man taken from Jerusalem to Babylon when the Babylonian Empire conquered Judah. He served in the Babylonian royal court for decades under multiple kings, surviving political upheaval, eventually rising to significant influence. The book of Daniel covers a long period from the early days of the Babylonian Empire through the transition to Persian rule. And throughout the book, Daniel records a series of visions, not stories about other people, his own personal visions, things he says he saw while he was in a state that he describes as something between sleep and waking. And the visions in the second half of the book, chapters 7 through 12, are where things get specific. The vision in chapter 8 has a specific date attached. Daniel says it happened in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, which historians place at approximately 550 BC. That date matters because what Daniel describes in chapter 8 involves events that historians place between roughly 550 and 330 BC, meaning the description precedes the events by decades in some cases. Let's look at what he actually saw. Daniel describes the vision in chapters 8 verses 1 through 14, and then the interpretation is given to him by a figure he identifies as the angel Gabriel in verses 15 through 27. I'm going to walk through both, the vision and the interpretation, because the text actually explains itself. We don't have to guess at what the symbols mean. Daniel tells us. Daniel says he saw a ram standing beside a river. The ram had two horns. One horn was longer than the other, and the longer one grew up after the shorter one. The ram was charging westward, northward, southward. No animal could stand against it. It did whatever it wanted and became great. That's the first image, a powerful two-horned ram charging in multiple directions, dominating everything it encountered. Then Daniel says he saw a goat coming from the west, moving so fast it wasn't even touching the ground. The goat had a single large horn between its eyes. It came at the ram with tremendous force, struck the ram, broke its two horns, knocked it to the ground, and trampled it. Nobody could rescue the ram from the goat. The goat became very powerful, but then, at the height of its power, its large horn was broken, and in its place, 4 horns grew up, pointing in 4 different directions. That's the vision. A powerful two-horned ram defeated by a fast-moving, single-horned goat whose horn breaks at the peak of its power and is replaced by 4 horns. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The angel Gabriel gives Daniel the interpretation directly in the text. He doesn't leave it symbolic. He names it. Gabriel says to Daniel, "The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia." He names it, Media and Persia, the Medo-Persian Empire, the same empire that, at the time Daniel is writing, was just beginning to rise to power under Cyrus the Great. The modern nation of Iran sits on the same land that was once the heart of the Persian Empire, the same geography, the same region. And Gabriel continues, "The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king." Greece. The fast-moving goat from the west is the Greek Empire. The single large horn, the first king, is a reference to a single dominant leader. Every serious historian identifies that as Alexander the Great. Let me just stop here and make sure this is landing clearly. Daniel chapter 8, written around 550 BC, describes a powerful empire from the east being defeated by a fast-moving empire from the west, led by a single dominant figure. Gabriel explicitly identifies the Eastern Empire as Persia. 200 years later, in 334 to 330 BC, Alexander the Great swept east from Greece and defeated the Persian Empire in one of the fastest military conquests in ancient history. His army moved so fast that historians still study it today. The Persian Empire, which had dominated the region for over 200 years, fell to Alexander in roughly 4 years. Daniel's vision described a goat moving so fast it wasn't touching the ground. Now Gabriel keeps going. He says, "The large horn that was broken and replaced by 4 horns represents 4 kingdoms that will emerge from that nation, but will not have the same power as the first king." Historically, when Alexander the Great died in 323 BC at the age of 32, his empire did not pass to a single successor. It was divided among his 4 generals. Cassander took Macedonia and Greece, Lysimachus took Thrace and Asia Minor, Seleucus took Babylonia and Persia, Ptolemy took Egypt. 4 kingdoms emerging from one empire, not as powerful individually as Alexander had been, exactly as described. Now here's the part I want to spend a little extra time on, because everything I've described so far, Persia rising, Greece defeating Persia, Alexander dying, empire splitting into 4, that's well-documented history. But there's a specific detail in Daniel's description of Persia that I think is worth looking at closely. He describes the ram, Persia, as having 2 horns, one shorter, one longer, and the longer one grew up after the shorter one. Gabriel identifies this as the kings of Media and Persia. The Medo-Persian Empire was not a single unified nation from the start. It was the combination of 2 peoples, the Medes and the Persians. Initially, the Medes were dominant. Then, under Cyrus the Great, the Persians overtook the Medes and became the dominant power within the same empire. two horns, one shorter, one longer, the longer one growing up after the shorter one. That's a specific internal dynamic of how the Medo-Persian Empire actually developed historically. Daniel says the ram charged westward, northward, southward. Historians note that the Persian Empire's major expansions went in exactly those three directions: west into Babylon, Lydia, and eventually toward Greece, north into regions around the Caspian Sea, south into Egypt. Not easy. The Persian Empire did not significantly expand east. Three directions: westward, northward, southward. That matches the actual historical expansion of Persia with unusual precision. I want to be straight with you about something. There are scholars who debate the dating of Daniel. Some argue parts of it were written later than 550 BC, which would change how we evaluate the predictive element. I'm not going to pretend that debate doesn't exist. It does, and it's a real academic conversation. What I can tell you is this: even under the most conservative dating of the book of Daniel, the descriptions in chapter 8 match the historical record of the Persian and Greek empires with a level of specificity that most ancient texts simply don't have. Whether you read that as prophecy, as history, or something in between, it's worth paying attention to. So let me address the Iran connection directly, because that's part of what this video is about. Persia and Iran are the same place. In 1935, the Iranian government formally asked the international community to use the name Iran, which is what Iranians had always called their country, instead of Persia, which was the name the outside world had used. So when Daniel describes Persia, he is geographically describing the territory that is today the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's not an interpretation. That's a geographical fact. Now, does that mean every current event involving Iran is a direct fulfillment of Daniel chapter 8? No, and I want to be careful here. Daniel chapter 8 has a specific historical context. The events it describes, the Persian Empire's rise, its defeat by Alexander, the division of the Greek Empire into four, those events have already happened. They're in the historical record. The prophecy, by most readings, was fulfilled in the period between roughly 550 and 300 BC. What Daniel chapter 8 tells us about Iran specifically is that this region, this geography, these peoples have been significant enough that an ancient text treated them as worth describing in detail. That's not nothing. So what do we actually take from all of this? Three things worth sitting with. Most Americans who didn't grow up in church think of the Bible as a collection of moral stories and general spiritual guidance. Daniel chapter 8 is something different. It's a text that names specific empires, describes specific behaviors, and makes specific claims about sequence of events. Whether you're religious or not, that specificity is worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing it without looking. The most common mistake people make with Bible prophecy is taking a verse out of context and mapping it directly onto whatever's in today's news. Daniel chapter 8 has a clear historical context. It was describing events in the ancient Near East in the period between 550 and 300 BC. Understanding that context doesn't make the text less interesting. It actually makes it more interesting, because when you see how precisely the historical events match the description, you're looking at something genuinely unusual. We did a full video on Daniel chapter 6, the lion's den. Today we looked at chapter 8. The book has 12 chapters, and almost every chapter has something in it that most people have never read carefully. Daniel is one of the most referenced books in the Bible, by the New Testament, by historians, by scholars across traditions. And most people know one story from it. The book is worth reading the whole way through. Let me just bring this together simply. Around 550 BC, Daniel records a vision in which a powerful two-horned ram from the east is defeated by a fast-moving single-horned goat from the west. An angel named Gabriel in the text identifies the ram as Persia, identifies the goat as Greece, identifies the broken horn as a first king, and the 4 replacement horns as 4 kingdoms. 200 years later, Alexander the Great swept east from Greece and defeated the Persian Empire in roughly 4 years. Alexander died young. His empire split among 4 generals. The historical record matches the description, point by point. The empire at the center of that description, Persia, is the same geography as the modern-day Iran. That's what the text says. That's what history records. Make of it what you will, but it's worth knowing it's there. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Going into this video, what did you think the book of Daniel was mostly about? And does what we looked at today change how you think about it at all? Drop it in the comments. I read every one of them, and on a topic like this, I'm genuinely curious where people land. If this gives you something to think about, hit the like button before you leave. It's a small thing, but it helps more people find this content. And if you want to keep going, we have a full video on Daniel chapter 6, the lion's den, that covers the side of Daniel most people know. This video was the side most people don't. Watch both, and you'll have a much fuller picture of one of the most interesting books in the Bible. The link is right up here. Subscribe if you want more of this. We read these things all the way through, slow enough to actually see what's there. I'll see you in the next one.